Hi, and welcome to the Biography, Memoir, and Personal Narrative Editors Picks panel. My name's Carly Ann Rittman, and I'm the Nonfiction Reviews Editor at Publishers Weekly. I'm excited to hear more about these books. We'll hear about powerful personal narratives and colorful biographies, and it's going to be really great to hear about what went into these stories. To get us started, 8 editors will join us via video to share the story behind a fall 2021 book that they're particularly excited about. Next, we'll highlight a few more notable titles of the season, and then the editor panelists will join live to take questions from the audience, which we invite you to submit throughout the program. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. In order to ask questions of the editors, enter them using the Zoom Q&A feature, which you can find toward the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to chat among yourselves using the Zoom chat function or back in the main US Book Show platform. But please note that we'll only be addressing questions that are entered into the Zoom Q&A feature. As you submit queries, if you see that someone has already asked your question, press the thumbs up button for that question to upvote it. Also, this panel will be recorded and accessible exclusively to other US Book Show attendees, so please don't record it on your own. And finally, a reminder that PW will not permit harassment of any kind during this program. Anyone not adhering to this policy will be asked to leave the US Book Show. And with that, let's get started.
Hello, I'm Allison Callahan, Vice President and Executive Editor with Gallery Books. Stanley Tucci is one of the most celebrated and beloved actors in contemporary film. But if you don't know him from The Devil Wears Prada, The Hunger Games, Spotlight, The Lovely Bones, Easy A, The Pelican Brief, or countless others, maybe you're familiar with his viral Instagram video demonstrating how to make the perfect Negroni. That clip, picked up by all of the various morning and late night shows alike, was just a small taste of Stan's love affair with food and drink, and now he's ready to serve the main course. Food has always meant family to Stan, who grew up in a big Italian household in Westchester, New York. He took the lessons and recipes he learned from his parents and grandparents with him into adulthood as he struggled to make it as an actor and eventually paid homage to them in such iconic films as Julie and Julia and Big Night. He used to co-own an Italian restaurant, but now a husband, father, and actor, he does most of his cooking with his family on weeknights. I like to think of Gallery as an extension of that family. We publish Stan's culinary secrets in the Tucci Table and the Tucci Cookbook, and with taste, we're welcoming him back to the table to go beyond the recipes and into the memories that inspired them. Not many people know the man behind Stanley's characters, but his story is worthy of a film itself. With the authority of a wise uncle and a few interstitial recipes because honestly, he can't help himself, Stan walks us through the highs and lows of his life, the school lunches that his classmates envied, waiting tables before getting his big break, the various meals and films on food sets, losing his first wife to breast cancer, and meeting his new wife, Felicity Blunt, through his Devil Wears Prada co-star. Each morsel of reflection is as brimming with heart, humor, and unexpected insight as the last. In March, CNN premiered his original food docuseries, Stanley Tucci Searching for Italy, in which he visited various regions of his home country, meeting the people and finding an understanding and appreciation of their heritage and history through the foods that have informed their lives. That show was an instant hit and has already been renewed for a second season, which begins filming in July. But to satiate his fans, his exquisite book will be available at bookstores everywhere on October 5th. Stanley is an actor, a director, a producer, and a writer. He has directed 5 films, appeared in over 70, countless television shows, and a dozen plays both on and off Broadway. He has been nominated for an Academy Award, a Tony, a Spoken Word Grammy, is a winner of 2 Golden Globe Awards and 2 Emmys, and has received numerous other critical and professional awards and accolades. I am so honored and thrilled for you all to read his first memoir and to hear about his life through food from the man himself. Bon appetit and enjoy.
Hi, my name is Lizzie Davis, and I'm an editor at Coffee House Press. The title of the book we'll be discussing today is The Breaks by Julietta Singh. The Breaks is an essay written in the form of a letter from the author to her 6-year-old daughter. It was pitched to us as a book about racial hybridity, inheritance, and mothering at the end of the world, but it's actually much more optimistic than that. It shows that children have a radical power to reimagine paths forward, to break with the the habits that we've inherited and to move toward a more just and equitable and tenable world. It's more important than ever to model these kinds of conversations with children. Julieta shows her daughter a wide range of concepts that are all vitally interconnected, from extractive capitalism to the violent legacies of patriarchy and colonialism to institutionalized racism. But she does all of this without ever losing sight of hope. I know it may sound like a bleak book, but it's not. It's really about finding one path forward. And to me, I would like to hand every parent who looks at those messages and thinks, but how? I would like to hand a copy of The Breaks, because it really models how you can approach these topics with your child in a way that makes parenting kind of the ultimate act of pedagogy, and the child's imagination a place for radical possibility and revitalization. So I hope that everyone who sees those chalk messages will pick up a copy of The Breaks. Well, Julieta had submitted a final draft, what was supposed to be a final draft of the book, right before the pandemic hit and before the murder of George Floyd and before the resultant uprising. And she did revise after those events, because addressing police brutality more directly and addressing the inequities that were heightened by the pandemic was so important to her. So that was something that we discussed quite a bit. And the book has really been a living thing. It has grown to encompass more and more of these difficult conversations that we increasingly have to have. I worry that the book will be pigeonholed as kind of a book exclusively for parents or exclusively for queer parents, but it's really a book for anyone. So I think the book is not just for parents, but it's for anyone who is looking for a way to approach the future without being totally nihilistic about it and finding a way forward. I also would like to say that there's another really important element of the book is Julieta lives in a duplex with her best friend and co-parent. They each live in one half of the duplex. And she writes a lot about the way that single family homes kind of reinforce this notion of small nuclear families, and how architecture can be played with, how you can play with space in order to embrace kind of a wider range of family dynamics. And it's really a celebration of queer family making. And I think that element is going to be very appealing to a number of readers beyond parents, people who wish to expand the notion of what a family can be.
My name is Jerry Howard, and I am an editor at Doubleday. Talking to you about Madam, the biography of Polly Adler, icon of the jazz age, by Debbie Applegate. It's a biography of a woman by the name of Polly Adler, whom some people may remember, probably older listeners, but she was the most prominent madam or brothel keeper of the 1920s. How a brothel keeper should become prominent in the 1920s is really the story of the book and of the era in which it is set. This book is of great interest, says the editor, for two reasons. One, because of the author, Debbie Applegate, whose previous book was a biography of a man named Henry Ward Beecher, who was probably the major religious figure in the American 19th century. That book was published more than a decade ago, and it sort of a masterpiece, I think. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and it made Debbie Applegate a star in the biographical field. But it's piquant, to say the least, that Debbie should follow up a book about a minister with a book about a madam. She was interested in something about the 1920s, and after a good deal of research, Polly Adler occurred to her as a figure who was exactly the right person for her to get deep, and I mean deep, into what was going on in the American 1920s, and especially in certain circles in New York City. Both the most colorful and, I have to say, most shocking pictures of the 1920s that I've ever read, and I suspect that any of my listeners will ever have read. We think of the 1920s and bootleggers and F. Scott Fitzgerald writing it all down and all of that. And all of that is true. But what doesn't really come through is both how really corrupt and violent that era was and how wide open it was. It's really, really jaw dropping. Polly Adler is the closest real life equivalent to the fictional Jay Gatsby that you're ever going to find. But it turned out that she had really a much better mind for business than she did for prostitution. And she was bankrolled by a gangster with the true name of Nick Montana, and she became really, really good at it. James Thurber, Dorothy Parker, Walter Winchell, as I mentioned, Mark Hellinger, and again, Robert Benchley. There were gangsters galore. There were politicians like Jimmy Walker, and just maybe Franklin D. Roosevelt. Actors and celebrities. There's Milton Berle, John Garfield, Desi Arnaz was a very enthusiastic client. Dorothy Lamour worked for Polly Adler, and that's a fact. So think about that the next time you see a Bob Hope, Bing Crosby movie.
My name is Megha Majumdar, and I work with Catapult. Well, Made in China is a debut memoir by Anna Q, and it's a book about how, as a young Chinese immigrant in Queens, she was made to work at a sweatshop that her mother and stepfather owned, and she was also made to work as a maid in their home, and she called child services on her mother. And this book is about what happened after. It's about her reflections on labor and identity, and it's about becoming a new American. You know, my first impression was that it is such a complicated story. It is so emotionally thorny. It is so morally thorny. I think generally we see a lot of immigration stories where there's a kind of tidy arc imposed on the story where it's this kind of upward movement. But here Anna Q is talking about her difficult relationship with her mother. She's talking about abuse. She's talking about being failed by the systems here in Queens that she reached out to. And there's a lot of ethical questions here, difficult moral questions to grapple with. So part of the book is, of course, about the sweatshop and her work in the house. But then the later part of the book is about her experience working at this shiny but struggling startup in Manhattan. And so she has had these two very different experiences of labor. And we wanted reflections on work to be a big part of the book. So that was something that we worked on. You know, it's been interesting working on this book over the pandemic because I think we've all been asking questions about who we are when we're not giving our labor. Who are we outside of work? How is our work identity wrapped up in who we are? So I think everybody who's been thinking about those questions will find something to think about in this book. And of course, anybody who's interested in a more complicated immigration story, somebody who's willing to look at how immigration stories are much more complex than they might first appear. I think those are the readers for this book. I've never read writing about a sweatshop in the way that Anna Q writes about it. You really feel the lint blowing in the air. You feel her holding the scissors for hours, which are giving her blisters. You feel the camaraderie of the women who are working there. They tell her not to look at the clock. That human environment where there is exhaustion and work and solidarity and just the feeling of being there as a young person newly arrived in Queens. I don't think any other book that I've read has taken me there, and I love that about this book.
I'm Christine Pride, and it's Simon & Schuster. Three Girls from Bronzeville by Dawn Turner. So this is a book by journalist Dawn Turner, and she follows the life of her best friend, and her sister, and the dramatic twists and turns their lives take, all fueled by this question of why. Why do some lives turn out the way they do, and what are all the forces at play, including race, class, friendship, sisterhood. It's really the whole bag. I love so much about this book. I mean, it's ambitious. It has a lot of different threads, which you always want great memoir to have. There's nothing one note about this book. The prose is amazing, and it also asks a question that a lot of us wrestle with, which is sort of how our lives play out. What are the forces at play in that? And even when we consider our loved ones, sort of what effect can we have on their lives, and what is the tragedy and heartbreak when the people that we love take different paths that we feel we can't save them from. One of the many strengths of this memoir is the way it blends a really heartfelt, deeply emotional, very intimate personal story with a very timely and political topic, which race and class in America today. And so it's the perfect balance of both, where you feel like you're reading an intimate memoir with the twists and turns of a novel, but you're also learning about how race and class are such insidious forces in our society, and how these kind of systemic issues play out in the lives of real women. Well, as an editor, this book was a treat to work on so many levels. I mean, part of it is that Dawn Turner herself is just one of the loveliest human beings that you could ever meet. But she really brings a journalistic eye to this project, honed by 2 decades at the Chicago Tribune. So it's really grounded in, facts, figures, research. She did her homework here. But at the end of the day, it's really a deeply felt personal story. And certainly there's a thirst to learn a lot about the forces of racism in our society. And there's a lot of books out there about, research, history, statistics, facts, etc., which are important. But in Dawn's case, it's sort of the classic show, don't tell. I mean, through the lens of the real lives of these three women who are really, appealing, relatable characters, you get to see firsthand how forces like race, class, gender, opportunity play out, in a real story, a heartfelt story, and a story that is riveting in its sort of unpredictable twists and turns, which are often the case of real life, right? We all experience unpredictable twists and turns. And that's really the power of this book, along with the amazing, amazing prose. I mean, Dawn Turner can turn a sentence.
So my name is Elizabeth Schmitz. I work at Grove Atlantic Publishing House. So the book pick is Things I Have Withheld by Kai Miller. This is a collection of essays by a poet and an award-winning poet and novelist who is writing for, I think, the first time, essays that are almost stories about what brings them together for him are to write about the silences between our conversations, things that are difficult to talk about and that we find ourselves clutched by speaking about, and how to access them and how to write about them. And specifically, Kai Miller writes about these silences that exist in all of our conversations about race in particular, but also about sex and gender. The first time this hit my desk was with a letter from his agent, Alice Whitwell, saying, "Elizabeth, I think this is a book for you." And the first line was, Kai is an award-winning poet. And for me, that just jumped right out at me. There's nothing I love more than having a new writer come, especially an essayist, a nonfiction writer who's been a poet, because I know he cares about language and the words, and that he will have crafted this and been very precise about his choice of words as he writes. And so as a poet and a novelist, I knew that Kai cared very much about style and lyricism and lilt and rhythms and conversation, and that he would be writing in that style. And that very much appealed to me right away. Kai is really tackling head on, even though this collection to me reads like a classic, it will be here forever, and historical and meaningful across many generations and decades. I think he's also very much speaking to this particular moment in time, how we are all grappling with how to cross divides and converse about so many difficult issues. I think he takes his title from a Dion Brand poem, which talks about how she will always be aware as a Black writer that she's addressing a white audience as well. And how can we bridge this gap and this divide? What really matters to me is the language and the way he writes. And I think his sort of the way this book, his writing seduces you in. It's very inviting and generous and wants to bring you into his world. And you come into it, and then he can just sort of shock you with what he experiences and what he shares with you. And I think that is something that is so, he's sort of seducing us and then shocking us, but in a very inviting way, like loping conversational way. He'll be talking about quotidian everyday things, and then he's just reaching for the universal. And the book is very emotional. I mean, I cried when I first read it, and I've cried every time I've read it since, in different places, discovering new areas. It's a very moving and important book, I think.
I'm Tracy Sherrod, and I'm the editorial director at Amistad, which is a division of HarperCollins. Miss Chloe, A Literary Friendship with Toni Morrison by A.J. Verdell. It's about a friendship between A.J. Verdell and Toni Morrison when A.J. Verdell published her debut novel, The Good Negress. The book is special to me because A.J.'s writing is exquisite. I mean, it's beautiful. And then to have the opportunity to get inside of a Black literary friendship, which is incredibly rare in the world of letters. But here we have the opportunity through A.J. Verdell to learn about A.J. and Toni. And so you hear from a master such as Toni Morrison, who was an editor and then a writer. And then we get to hear the words, the intimate words that she shared with A.J. about writing, about publishing, about the imagination and the power of it. The most striking part of their relationship for me was the way that they blended the personal and professional. You know, how they could be making potato salad or biscuits or something, yet at the same time speak about the imagination and the craft of writing and taking ownership of one's work. You know, I believe that good writing is for anybody. Period. Anybody. Because good writing is where you can't tear your eyes away from the page. You must, you're just so engaged, you must know what else happens. But I think for a lot of young writers, it will be very special to them. For people who want to better understand Toni Morris's intent with her words, will definitely appreciate this book. And I think that people of color who are invested in writing and publishing and its history this book will most definitely speak to them. Yes, this book is very important, and especially if you're interested in the fine craft of writing and what's involved in that and the level of commitment that it takes. This is an unforgettable book. You will learn about Toni in ways you never thought. You will learn about the process of writing, about what can go right in publishing and what can go severely wrong, and how, because we all care so much about talent, it can still all come together for the better.
I'm Molly Walls, and I'm at Farrar, Straus and True. The book is called Shelf Life: Chronicles of a Cairo Bookseller, and it's by Nadia Wassef. It's about Nadia's experiences as a co-founder and longtime owner of Diwan, which is a bookstore in Cairo in Egypt, in the years leading up to and following the Egyptian Revolution. Basically, the story of the author and the story of this store, Diwan, are kind of inextricably linked. Her life has been fully given to it for the last 2 decades. And it's this very classic kind of underdog tale of these 3 women, Nadia, who's the writer, her sister Hind, and their friend Nihal, sort of setting out to do the impossible, which is start this bookstore where there weren't really any stores like it. So there's this great kind of sense of adventure inherent in that, and of fearlessness of doing what hasn't been done. At the center of that, there's this oasis, which is the store itself. So I love how she physically builds that world. But it's definitely a balancing act between the personal and the political and the historical, and the story of this bookstore. I love Nadia's voice. It's one that I want to listen to. It's so warm and funny on the page, and also determined and crass, and just full of contradictions. She's sort of compulsively controlling and crazed, but also so generous and warm. So I think that's very central to the story itself. One thing that's powerful about this book is that I can imagine so many different readerships for it, is this kind of feminist manifesto element, this story of women behaving fearlessly. So I think women and women in business specifically will connect to Nadia's narrative. All readers and lovers of books can find something to admire in this. There are recommendations galore. I think it's a great transportive narrative for people who've not been to Cairo, who are not familiar with the city. And it's also, I think, a highly original work of history, the history of the city, of censorship, of governmental regimes there, and also of the Egyptian Revolution, which is a narrative that's been so frequently foibled by the Western media. Nadia's book is really wonderful and lived in corrective to some of the ways that the Western media has failed to tell that story. So history lovers, scholars, book lovers, feminists, business people, I think there's much to see here. So each chapter follows a physical section of the bookstore, from the cafe to cookery to pregnancy and parenting. And Nadia uses those physical sections as these kind of essayistic springboards to reflect on related topics and questions in this way that I think is very masterful and kind of delightfully interwoven.
A big thank you to all of those editors for sharing that with us. Though we received hundreds of submissions, we could only feature 8 for this panel, but we'd like to share some further notable titles that should also be on your radar this season. Burning Boy, The Life and Work of Stephen Crane by Paul Auster, published by Henry Holt. The Death of My Father the Pope, a memoir by Obed Silva, published by MCD. Let's Get Physical by Danielle Friedman, published by Penguin Random House's Putnam imprint. The Light Streamed Beneath It, a memoir of grief and celebration by Sean Hitchens, published by ECW Press. The Master, The Brilliant Career of Roger Federer by Christopher Clary, published by Hachette's 12 imprint. My Life in Dire Straits by John Ilsley, published by Diversion Books. And A Tale of Two Omars, a memoir of family revolution and coming out during the Arab Spring by Omar Sharif Jr., published by Counterpoint Press.